Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. In December of 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers stationed on a remote island in the Aleutian archipelago vanished without a trace. Was their disappearance the result of a tragic accident, or was there something more sinister at work? Join us as we explore the unsolved mystery of the North Star Lighthouse. On the evening of December 7th, 1900, Inspector Michael Harrison of the Pacific Lighthouse Commission stepped off the rickety wooden dock of Foggy Island and onto his waiting launch. Having shaken hands and bid farewell to his 3 colleagues, he headed toward a larger steam vessel anchored offshore that would take him back to the mainland. As his small boat navigated the churning waters, he looked back at the men he had left behind on the tiny, isolated island to maintain its lighthouse. Their names were William Patterson, Robert Kingston, and Marcus Sullivan, and they stood on the landing, waving to him. As he raised his hand to return their gesture, not once did the thought cross his mind that he would be the last person to ever see them alive. When the relief vessel arrived 19 days later, they had vanished without a trace. Foggy Island, one of the many small outcrops scattered across the Aleutian chain, some 40 miles off the Alaskan coast, would become the setting for this haunting disappearance. Something about the mystery of these 3 men, isolated at the edge of civilization and surrounded by the vast, hostile Pacific Ocean, sends shivers down one's spine. The island itself was named for its near-constant shroud of mist, and for generations it had remained uninhabited. Native Aleut people from neighboring islands always viewed this bleak and desolate rock with deep superstition. Many fishing boats and trading vessels had been wrecked there over the years, and although local hunters occasionally visited to hunt seals, they believed it deeply unlucky to spend a night there. During the 1890s, the Pacific Lighthouse Commission decided to construct a lighthouse on Foggy Island. It took 5 years, with construction constantly hindered by the fierce Pacific storms that made landing supplies nearly impossible. Nevertheless, the lighthouse was completed and began operation on December 7th, 1899. It had no wireless communication, and the only way of contacting the mainland was through visual signal flags that could be seen by nearby islands on clear days. The mystery begins on the night of December 15th, 1900, when a violent storm erupted around the island. The first sign that something was amiss came when Captain Anderson of the Japanese freighter Hokuto Maru, en route from Yokohama to Anchorage, passed close to Foggy Island just before midnight and noticed the lighthouse was completely dark. Something almost unheard of for an operational station. This was reported when the ship docked at Kodiak several hours later. But due to the treacherous weather conditions, no immediate action could be taken. The relief vessel Northern Star was scheduled to depart on December 20th, but adverse weather delayed its departure until dawn on December 26th. It carried fresh supplies and relief keeper David Morrison. As they approached the east landing, Captain Peter Walsh sounded 3 long blasts on the ship's horn and launched a distress flare. But no response came from the island. From the moment they arrived, it was clear something was terribly wrong. There was no welcoming party from the three men, who would normally have been outside to greet them. No supply crates had been prepared for restocking, and the signal flag wasn't flying on its pole. Save for the mournful cry of seabirds overhead and the ominous crash of waves against the black cliff faces, the island was eerily silent. The Northern Star moored in silence, and David Morrison set off toward the island alone. Upon reaching the landing, he immediately made his way up the steep path toward the lighthouse, calling out to the three men as he went, but there was no reply. He found the entrance gate to the compound and main door both locked. Inside the lighthouse itself, nothing seemed obviously disturbed. The lamps were cleaned and refilled. The beds were unmade as if the men had just risen. Dishes were washed, and cold ashes lay in the fireplace. During his initial inspection, Morrison discovered an overturned chair in the kitchen and noticed all the clocks had stopped. This only heightened his concerns. Returning to the Northern Star, Morrison reported his findings to the captain, then made his way back to the lighthouse with additional crew members to conduct a broader search. While the east landing was intact, the west landing showed significant storm damage. A storage box 70 feet above sea level had been smashed, and its contents scattered. Iron railings were twisted, the path's guardrail had been torn from its concrete base, and a boulder weighing more than a ton had been displaced. Above that, at over 200 feet above sea level, turf had been ripped away as far as 30 feet from the cliff edge. Further investigation revealed that the keepers had maintained their log until 9 a.m. on December 15th, and their entries indicated the damage had occurred before their disappearance. The only other significant evidence was that 2 sets of oilskin rain gear were missing. Only 1 set of outdoor clothing remained hanging by the entrance, suggesting one man had ventured outside without protective gear. Surprising given the severity of the weather during a harsh Alaskan winter. Of the keepers themselves, there was no trace, either inside the lighthouse or anywhere else on the island. They had simply vanished. Morrison and 3 volunteer sailors remained behind to resume lighthouse operations, while the Northern Star returned to the shore station at Kodiak. From there, Captain Walsh sent a telegram to the Pacific Lighthouse Commission dated December 26, 1900. A dreadful accident has occurred at North Star. The 3 keepers, Patterson, Kingston, and Sullivan, have disappeared from the island. The clocks are stopped, and other signs indicate the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor souls, they must have been swept over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure equipment during the storm. The mystery of North Star Lighthouse has fascinated people ever since, inspiring countless stories, songs, and even a stage play. But the full truth may never be known. Some details added over the years are pure fiction. Tales of half-eaten meals found on the table, or mysterious log entries about the keeper's mental states. The only actual log entries concerned the damage at the West Landing and basic weather observations. There was nothing recorded about any keeper's emotional state or unusual behavior. No bodies were ever recovered. No additional clues ever surfaced. We can only speculate about what happened on that windswept island in that cold December at the dawn of the 20th century. Theories have ranged from murder-suicide to sea monsters, from foreign spies to supernatural entities. Local fishermen spoke of strange lights seen near the island that night, and in later decades, some even suggested extraterrestrial involvement. But the simplest explanation is often correct, as the Pacific Lighthouse Commission concluded in their investigation. The three men were likely caught off guard by a massive rogue wave. Patterson and Kingston had probably gone to secure damaged equipment at the West Landing, while Sullivan remained inside the lighthouse as procedures required. From his vantage point, Sullivan would have spotted an enormous swell approaching and rushed outside to warn his colleagues, but arrived too late. All three men were likely swept away by the incoming wave. This would explain the overturned chair, the remaining set of oilskins, and why all three men were outside together. However, questions remain. If Sullivan left in such haste, why were the lighthouse door and compound gate locked? How were three experienced keepers, who had spent countless hours working in treacherous conditions, caught unaware by a rogue wave? And if that was indeed their fate, why were no bodies ever recovered, as was typical in these waters? The lighthouse remained staffed without further incident until 1971, when it was fully automated. It continues operating today, with maintenance crews visiting only occasionally. Over the years, Foggy Island never quite lived up to its cursed reputation, as nothing unusual ever occurred there again. But the mystery of North Star Lighthouse lives on, perhaps forevermore. In closing, we leave you with the words of Inspector Harrison, who in his official report, dated January 8th, 1901, wrote of the keepers. I visited them as recently as December 7th, and carry the melancholy burden of knowing I was the last person to shake their hands and bid them farewell. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I live about 20 miles outside of Millfield, where I work at the local newspaper. My place is tucked away in the woods, and just a 5-minute walk from my cabin, there's a stretch of Old County Road. Right at the intersection stands Roy's Corner Store, one of those mom-and-pop places that stays open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, a blessing for night owls like me. Last Tuesday night, or I guess technically it was Wednesday morning, I found myself walking down there around 2 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, and sometimes a midnight stroll helps clear my head. Plus, I had a craving for those chili lime sunflower seeds, Roy stalks, that I can't find anywhere else. The October air had that perfect autumn bite to it, and the moon was nearly full, casting long shadows through the pine trees. As I approached the store, I noticed just one vehicle in the parking lot, a beat-up blue pickup. Nothing unusual there. At that hour, it's typically just whoever's working the graveyard shift, and maybe one other customer, if any. Have you ever experienced that strange sensation, like the back of your neck starts tingling, and something deep inside you whispers that something isn't right? That's exactly what hit me as I reached for the door handle. The fluorescent lights were buzzing inside as usual, but something felt off. The little bell chimed as I pushed open the door, but nobody was there to greet me. No one behind the counter. No one stocking shelves. No one anywhere in the little store. I figured Denise, who usually works Tuesday nights, must be in the bathroom or maybe the storage room in back. She probably heard the bell when I came in. But that feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. I waited what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a minute or two. The silence was eerie. Normally there's at least the sound of a radio or the hum of the refrigerators, but everything seemed unnaturally quiet. "Hello? Anybody here?" I called out, my voice sounding strangely loud in the empty store. I waited another minute or so, then decided to leave the sunflower seeds where they were and head out. I paused by the blue pickup, peering through the windows, but seeing nothing unusual. Just some empty coffee cups and work gloves on the passenger seat. I also checked around the back of the store, but there was nobody there either. Just the dumpster and some empty cardboard boxes stacked against the wall. The whole situation had me seriously unsettled, so I pulled out my cell phone and called the sheriff's department. They arrived in about 20 minutes, though it felt like hours as I waited by my car across the street. Deputy Harmon and another officer I didn't recognize conducted a thorough search. When they came back out, their faces told me everything before they said a word. They'd found Denise in the walk-in cooler, hidden behind stacks of beer cases. She'd been strangled. They immediately called for backup and asked me to recount everything I'd seen or heard. After giving my statement, I was finally allowed to drive home, shaken to my core. But what happened next made everything even more disturbing. As I pulled up to my cabin, my headlights swept across something unusual. My cat, Merlin, was sitting on the front porch railing. He's strictly an indoor cat who's terrified of the outdoors. And the front door was cracked open about 4 inches. My heart nearly exploded out of my chest. I grabbed Merlin, jumped back in my car, and sped back toward town to find Deputy Harmon. 2 deputies immediately headed to my place to investigate. When they finally let me return home 3 hours later, they told me nothing appeared to be stolen, but there were clear signs someone had been inside. Drawers had been opened in my bedroom, and oddly, several photos of me had been removed from frames around the house. The strangest detail, though something I didn't share with the deputies because it seemed too bizarre, was that someone had left a small pile of chili lime sunflower seeds on my kitchen counter. The same ones I'd been craving when I went to Roy's. I haven't slept through the night since, and I keep wondering, what if I hadn't gone out for those seeds? Or worse, what if I'd gotten there 15 minutes earlier? In the aftermath of World War II, the victorious Allied nations dispatched numerous military expeditions to the Arctic region. Did these warships weigh anchor in the name of science and exploration? Or did they set sail in search of something far more sinister, an evil that dwelt under the ice? No matter how many times Captain Magnus Thorvald and his crew spent the winter season scouring the waters around the Arctic Circle, perpetual darkness was something they never really managed to adapt to. The unending periods of night made it considerably harder to detect the invaluable seal herds which they were desperately hunting. And it also reduced the ship's crew to little more than shambling, sleep-deprived zombies. This might have explained why the lookout aboard the Valkyrie that morning had been so slow to react to the vessel that was now floating just a short distance off their port beam. Thorvald had been down in his cabin, staring dejectedly at his charts, hoping they might somehow inspire him to reverse the fortunes of what had so far been a wasted journey all the way from their native Norway. Then he'd heard the shouting coming from above. The Norwegian captain stood on deck alongside the rest of his crew, staring helplessly across the water at the deck gun that was now trained on his ship. Even without her infamous eagle and swastika naval ensign on display, there was no mistaking the sleek lines of the Kriegsmarine U-boat. There had been stories of German submarines which had either failed to hear or obey the final orders to surrender. But the war had been over for almost 3 years now. Just what had they stumbled across? Figures in white-gray winter gear were now hurrying across the deck of the submarine, and a short time later 2 inflatables made their way towards the Valkyrie. With no weapons on board to defend themselves and no other ships in the vicinity to hear their transmissions, Thorvald ordered his men to line up and to offer no resistance to their captors. As the Germans hauled themselves up over the railings, a figure broke away from their number and strolled confidently over to where Thorvald was standing. The U-boat captain cheerfully apologized for the disruption, asking if it would be possible for him and his crew to purchase half of the remaining supplies aboard the hunting ship. Despite his affable and polite nature, there was a tone to the submariner's request which led Thorvald to believe that refusal on his part would be unwise. He noted uneasily that each of the German sailors were armed with either a Luger pistol or a Mauser carbine, and so reluctantly agreed to the proposal. He was immediately handed a thick roll of Swiss francs and was advised that there should be enough left over for each of his crew to receive a small bonus for their troubles. As the submarine commander later turned to leave, he paused and asked Thorvald to bring one of his charts up from his cabin. He then marked down a location not too far away, advising that there was a large pod of beluga whales to be found there, before saluting and disappearing back over the side of the ship. The Norwegian crew watched in bewilderment as the submarine turned away, and then slowly made its way off into the distance, never to be seen again. On the 4th of January 1948, a flotilla of U.S. ships set off from the naval base in Reykjavik, Iceland. The expedition had been designated Operation Northern Beam and consisted of 11 vessels, including the aircraft carrier USS Intrepid, as well as the destroyers USS Talbot and USS Morrison. They had been ordered to make their way deep into the desolation of the Arctic Circle in order to conduct a combination of military drills and scientific experiments. In charge of the operation was Rear Admiral James Foster, a seasoned polar explorer who had carried out numerous previous civilian and military expeditions into the Arctic. When the task force eventually arrived at its destination, it immediately began to conduct extensive photo reconnaissance operations of the area, but would subsequently be recalled only a few weeks later due to reports of dangerous weather conditions. Soon after, the ships which had taken part in the operation returned to their respective home ports. Rumors and stories about what had really happened began to circulate. Newspaper articles in the Icelandic media claimed that the U.S. fleet had been attacked by unidentified flying craft that had inflicted heavy casualties, forcing the Americans to withdraw. Speculation was only fueled even further when, during a television interview about the mission. Admiral Foster made a number of significant comments in relation to America having to prepare herself for future attacks that might emanate from the Arctic. He specifically referred to the risk of aircraft attacking the United States having come from the North Pole, and that he and his countrymen could no longer rely on their distance from other hostile nations as an effective means of defending themselves. Almost immediately, a follow-up mission to the remote region was authorized, codenamed Operation Frostbite, which was concluded in March of 1949. After this, American interest in the region seemed to wane, up until the decision over a decade later to detonate 2 nuclear devices there. The rationale for this action was to test the effects of high-altitude nuclear explosions in the Earth's upper atmosphere. It is possible that America's brief fascination with the northern polar region might ultimately have been forgotten, had it not been for the publication in 1993 of a Soviet-era intelligence report, which offered a very different reason for the untimely conclusion of Operation Northern Beam. Allegedly compiled from transcripts of interviews between KGB agents and a handful of U.S. sailors who were involved in the expedition. The leaked dossier suggested that the American fleet had been attacked and driven away from the Arctic by an unknown hostile power. The report details that by late January of 1948, the American ships were making their way through the Barents Sea when the USS Talbot became aware of unknown aircraft shadowing her movements. Initially, these were described as fast-moving lights off in the far distance, but as they gradually started to venture closer and closer, contacts also began to register on the Talbot's radar screens. As the U.S. ships had closed up together, 5 of the craft had started to overfly the fleet at low altitude, dodging and weaving in and out of the tightly packed American vessels at breakneck speeds. Deeming their actions hostile, Captain Reynolds ordered the Talbot's gunners to target the attackers, the destroyer immediately opening fire using her 40mm anti-aircraft cannons. The witnesses described the 5 unidentified aircraft as disc-shaped and testified that as soon as the Talbot opened fire, the mysterious craft retaliated with incredible beams of light and heat. As fighter aircraft had been scrambling to launch from the deck of the USS Intrepid, they had been burned out of the sky, their airframes and crews reduced to little more than ash by the advanced enemy weaponry. Return fire from the Americans proved relatively ineffective due to the superior speed and maneuverability of the attackers. But while the battle progressed, there was some success. As one of the mysterious craft passed over the USS Barracuda, a lucky shot from the submarine's deck gun caught it, the 5-inch shell sending the flying machine spinning wildly off to one side. The downed aircraft had detonated violently as it impacted the water surface. But then there was another, greater explosion. The USS Morrison, a destroyer attached to the task force, had sustained serious damage as a result of the relentless attack, including a fire that had fatally spread to her magazines. The resultant explosion killed all those aboard and sent the stricken vessel to the seafloor. Realizing they were outmatched, the Americans would spend the next few days retreating out of the area, continually harassed by the unknown attackers. The writer of the report ended by speculating that the subsequent U.S. mission to the region had also failed to defeat the forces that had been ranged against them, and that the Americans had eventually resorted to nuclear weapons in a final bid to defeat their mysterious opponent. The Soviet document was seized upon by commentators and conspiracy theorists the world over as proof that there was something sinister lurking within the safety of the North Pole. For some, it was the definitive proof that aliens lived and walked among us. To others, this was the last bastion of Nazi resistance to have survived the Second World War. And then there were those who theorized that the answer lay in combining these two theories. As Hitler's fugitive forces utilized alien technology, they had uncovered to build a glorious Fourth Reich underneath the Arctic ice caps. Even from just a cursory inspection, it is evident that there are glaring errors contained within the Soviet report that undermine its credibility. But then this is perhaps unsurprising. Material produced by Russian intelligence staff during the communist era is largely typified by the need to create what the author's masters wanted to hear, rather than a more truthful representation of the actual events. For example, repeated references are made to the USS Barracuda, an attack submarine which did not sail with the Northern Beam Flotilla and was instead laid up in Boston, awaiting her decommission during the expedition. It is possible that over time the witnesses have confused the Barracuda with the USS Sturgeon. But then there is also the issue of the alleged sinking of the USS Morrison. Again, the Morrison did not play any part in the Arctic mission. 2 destroyers of that name were constructed by the U.S. Navy during the Second World War. The first was sunk by Japanese kamikaze during the Battle of Okinawa in 1945. Her namesake also saw active service during the conflict and also went on to participate in the Korean War, where she was involved in the infamous Wonsan Harbor incident. But neither would have been in the Arctic during the winter of 1948. Finally, the references to American fighter aircraft being destroyed and mass casualties having been inflicted by the attackers is strongly contradicted by the official Northern Beam diaries. In total, the expedition is reported to have sustained 3 fatalities during its time in the Arctic. 2 men perished when their PBY Catalina crashed in poor weather conditions. A further sailor was crushed during an accident while unloading scientific equipment onto the ice. If we are at all to buy into the Soviet narrative, then there are 2 possible explanations for these inaccuracies. The first is that the report was an exercise in disinformation, designed by the United States to draw out traitors in their ranks and to deliberately confuse their opponent. The second is that the incident was indeed genuine, and that the American government used the fear and paranoia of the Cold War to suppress and hide all trace of it, with national security acting as justification. So is it simple enough to write off the Russian account as a work of mere fiction? Perhaps, but it is apparent that something unexpected did occur, which forced the Northern Beam expedition to conclude unexpectedly ahead of schedule. Also worth considering are the cryptic comments made by Rear Admiral Foster about America suddenly having much more to fear from possible attackers emanating from that region. It is, of course, easy to dismiss the fantastic conspiracy theories of a sprawling Nazi stronghold hidden inside gigantic geothermal vents that were discovered underneath the ice. But the fact remains that one of Hitler's many aims was the establishment of a presence for the Third Reich in all of the world's far-flung regions, a goal in which he would invest significant time and effort. In 1939, a German freighter named the MS Boreas set sail from its home port of Bremen and made its way up through the North Atlantic towards the Arctic. The ship was carrying 2 Arado seaplanes that had been fitted out with skis, which would allow the crew to land on the ice. The mission was commanded by a famed German explorer named Heinrich Salzmann. The German expedition eventually made landfall in an area known as the Franz Joseph Land, which had previously been claimed by the Soviet government. They immediately renamed it New Germania, establishing a permanent research station for their scientists to work from, and carrying out numerous aerial reconnaissance missions of the area surrounding their encampment. Salzmann and his crew would return to Bremen 6 months later and would immediately begin plans for another trip back to the area. However, official records indicate that this second expedition never took place, as the progression of World War II prevented them from being able to pull together the manpower and resources they would have needed. It is clear, though, that the German government did succeed in conducting further undocumented forays into the polar regions. As recently as 2017, the remains of an abandoned naval outpost, previously unknown, were discovered on the island of Novaya Zemlya near the Arctic Circle. Its rusting bunkers and Nazi flags provided damning evidence that there is much we still do not know about Adolf Hitler and his secretive ambitions. Captain Thorvald's alleged encounter with a mysterious German submarine in early 1948 has largely been dismissed as a fantasy, and yet it remains far from an impossibility. Of the 150 or so large vessels that have historically vanished without trace from the world's oceans, and which remain missing to this day, a significant number are German U-boats. 1,000 of these submarines were put to sea during the Second World War, with over 15 still unaccounted for. Their fates and final resting places a complete mystery. It is also well documented that Luftwaffe engineers did indeed successfully create aircraft using technology considered revolutionary for their time, and that some of these prototypes did resemble what has come to be accepted as the classic outline of a flying disc. The most well-known of these was the Haunebu, which supposedly only managed a number of test flights before the bases it was operating from were overrun by occupying forces in the dying days of the war. There is little doubt that, given time, the Germans might have been able to turn the tide of battle, and that they did not require extraterrestrial technology in order to do so. After all, German science, technology, and engineering were instrumental in breaking the sound barrier, producing the first working long-range ballistic missiles and the earliest example of a stealth aircraft. The Haunebu was not powered by Martian technology, but was allegedly one huge jet turbine housed within a circular airframe. It was said to be capable of a speed and maneuverability unrivaled for its era, and it is terrifying to think of the losses it might have inflicted on the Allied powers, given even just a few further months of experimentation. Once the more fantastic and outlandish elements of the Operation Northern Beam saga are stripped away, what should easily be dismissed as a creative piece of science fiction does seem to retain a concerning amount of substance. It is uncomfortably apparent that the military might of the United States did encounter something unexpected during their post-war expedition to the North Pole. Something that they felt the need to repeatedly confront and potentially even resort to nuclear warfare in order to vanquish. Whether this mysterious force was extraterrestrial in nature, or was instead born out of the darkest crimes in human history, may never officially be known. We shall have to wait and see what other evidence waits to be uncovered as human exploration of the Arctic region continues. Who knows what abandoned settlements and sunken vessels lie waiting to be discovered, perfectly preserved beneath the polar ice. Last week, I made a cross-country drive with my ferret, Bandit. We were heading from Arizona to Colorado through some pretty desolate stretches of desert highway. The journey had been grueling 15 hours on the road, with only a few quick breaks. It was the middle of winter, and even though the clock showed just 7:45 in the evening, the sky was pitch black, with stars scattered across the vast emptiness like distant campfires. I hadn't planned on stopping again before reaching Albuquerque, but my bladder had other ideas, and I couldn't leave Bandit alone in the car. He gets anxious when left alone in unfamiliar places, and I'd already subjected him to enough stress with this marathon drive. I found this isolated truck stop, one of those places that seems to materialize out of nowhere in the desert, its neon sign flickering like a distress signal against the darkness. After putting Bandit in his travel harness, we entered the truck stop together. The fluorescent lights inside hummed and cast everything in a sickly greenish glow. I approached the cashier, a weathered man with deep crow's feet around his eyes, and asked if pets were allowed in the restroom. "Long as he don't make a mess," he shrugged, barely looking up from his crossword puzzle. The store wasn't deserted like you might expect at that hour. A pair of truckers in worn baseball caps were browsing the snack aisle, and a woman with faded red hair was chatting with another employee near the coffee station. They spoke with the familiar ease of people who have known each other for years. I headed to the restroom with Bandit perched on my shoulder. Once inside, I placed him on the sink counter while I used the facilities. Suddenly, the door handle began to rattle. Bandit immediately tensed up, his little body going rigid. I chuckled nervously and called out, "Sorry, occupied." Bandit is usually pretty chill in public places. I've trained him well, but he absolutely despises long car rides. After that door handle scare, his fur stood on end, and he scrambled up my arm to perch on my shoulder, his claws digging into my jacket. He started making this low, guttural chittering sound that I've only heard a handful of times, always when he was genuinely frightened. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. Bandit stretched his neck toward the door, baring his tiny, sharp teeth. My laughter died in my throat as I called out more firmly, "Someone's in here." That's when I heard them. Two men speaking in heavily accented Russian, a language I learned during my 3 years working at an international shipping company. What they said turned my blood to ice. "Maybe grab her when she comes out," one voice suggested. The word he used, "eskavate has no ambiguity in Russian. It means to seize, to forcibly take. The second voice replied, "No employees around. We'll wait outside. Pretty sure her ride is the white pickup." Bandit let out another warning chitter, more aggressive than before. I tried to soothe him, but my hand was trembling too badly. The bathroom had no windows, and my black SUV was parked in the darkest corner of the lot, away from the building's lights. I'd deliberately chosen that spot because my vehicle was loaded with everything I owned after breaking my lease and leaving Phoenix in a hurry. But my car wasn't a white pickup. After a few tense seconds, I heard their footsteps fade away. Bandit and I remained frozen in that cramped stall for what felt like forever, my mind racing through potential escape routes. A gentle knock startled me. "Miss, it was the cashier. My shift partner says you should come out now. She'll walk you to your car through our delivery entrance. Those guys are still out front by the gas pumps." I cracked open the door cautiously. The woman with faded red hair stood there, worry evident in her eyes. She nodded once, gesturing for me to follow her through a narrow hallway labeled "Staff Only." Maybe following a stranger through a back exit wasn't the smartest move, but my options seemed limited. Outside, I spotted my SUV about 20 yards away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I remembered I'd set the alarm. I pressed the unlock button, and the chirp seemed to echo across the empty lot. Bandit flinched at the sound and dug his claws deeper into my shoulder. Despite the pain, I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and hit the child's safety locks just in case. My heart hammered against my ribs as I started the engine and shifted into reverse. In my rearview mirror, I caught sight of a man loitering beside a white pickup truck, pretending to smoke while scanning the parking lot. He didn't even notice as I pulled away, my headlights off until I reached the highway entrance. I drove for another 3 hours straight after that, jumping at every set of headlights that appeared in my mirrors. Bandit finally settled down enough to curl up in his travel bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something terrible. When I finally checked into a motel just across the Colorado border, I made sure to request a room facing the office, where the night manager could see my car. As I lay awake that night, absently stroking Bandit's fur, I couldn't stop thinking about those men, and how different things might have been if my ferret hadn't sensed danger before I did, or if those truck stop employees hadn't intervened. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, waiting at desert rest stops for travelers who won't be as lucky as I was. I was about 21, maybe 22 at the time, driving back from a concert in Chicago. It was early October, that perfect time when the Midwest starts to cool down, but hasn't yet surrendered to winter. The show had run late, and my friends had wanted to grab food after, so I didn't get on the road until almost 2 in the morning. Interstate 80 was practically deserted at that hour. Just the occasional semi-truck driver and me, watching the broken yellow lines disappear under my headlights. I was still riding the high from the concert, singing along to the band's latest album that I downloaded before the show. About an hour outside the city, I noticed my fuel gauge dipping into the red. My old Subaru had always been reliable, but its gas gauge was temperamental at best. Sometimes you could drive another 30 miles on empty, and other times it would sputter to a stop right when the needle touched the red line. I wasn't about to find out which scenario I was facing tonight. I'd had my fair share of uncomfortable encounters at gas stations, especially as a woman traveling alone. Men with lingering gazes or comments, just unsettling enough to make my skin crawl, but not quite threatening enough to report. So I developed a sort of sixth sense about these places, particularly in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. Looking back, if I hadn't been so vigilant that night, I might have been abducted, or worse. The first gas station I spotted was just off exit 53. It was well lit and seemed safe enough. One of those newer corporate chains with bright LED lighting flooding the forecourt. The type of place where you could see everything clearly from every angle. I pulled up to pump number 4 and checked all my mirrors before turning off the engine. As I swiped my card and began fueling, I noticed a man walking out of the convenience store. He looked ordinary enough, early 30s, wearing a dark blue hoodie and jeans, smoking a cigarette as he leaned against the wall. The pump kept clicking off prematurely, and I was fighting with the handle, trying to get a decent flow going. That's when I realized he was watching me. Not just glancing, but staring, with this smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I thought maybe he was just amused by my struggles with the faulty pump, or perhaps smiling about something entirely unrelated. Still, something about the intensity of his gaze made me uneasy. I managed to get just enough gas, maybe $10 worth, before giving up and deciding to try another pump. That's when things started to get unsettling. I got back in my car, locked the doors immediately. A habit my father had drilled into me since I first started driving, and moved to another pump on the opposite side of the station. I always checked my mirrors obsessively in situations like this, scanning for anything out of place before shutting off the engine or stepping out of the car. My Subaru had crossed the 100,000-mile mark years ago, and sometimes needed coaxing to start, so I kept it running. In my rearview mirror, I saw the man flick his cigarette away and start walking toward my car. He was still smiling as he approached my driver's side window. Not wanting him to get too close to me, I rolled down the passenger window just a few inches. He paused, that smile widening slightly, then changed course and walked around to the passenger side. He leaned down, his face almost pressed against the narrow opening of the window, and started talking. "Hey there, I know this probably seems weird, but I swear I'm not some creep. My truck broke down back there on the highway," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a silver pickup I could just make out parked near the exit. "I just need a ride, it's super close, less than half a mile from here off the county road." I firmly replied, "I'm sorry, but I don't know you." He tried to appear polite and understanding. "Yeah, I get it, this is awkward for me too, but it's literally right down the road." "I'm kinda stranded here," I repeated. "I wish I could help, but I can't." "I don't know you," he persisted. "If you had a bigger vehicle, I wouldn't even need to sit up front, I could just ride in the back." I shook my head and said, "I'm sorry, but no." The transformation was instant. His face hardened, eyes narrowing as anger flashed across his features. He yanked at my door handle forcefully, but thankfully the doors were locked. Then he tried to reach through the partially open passenger window, stretching his arm to grab the interior handle. Thank God my engine was still running. I quickly shifted into drive and accelerated sharply, just as he was still trying to get the door open. The sudden movement caused the door to slam shut, his arm narrowly avoiding being caught. I sped away, heart pounding in my chest, knuckles white on the steering wheel. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before I felt safe enough to pull over at a brightly lit truck stop with plenty of people around. Only then did I call the police. I explained what had happened, and they said they would check the security footage at the gas station. The officer called me back an hour later. The cameras had caught everything, including what happened after I left. The man had calmly walked back to his pickup truck, but here's the twist: he wasn't alone. There was another person waiting in the cab. They pulled out and followed the direction I had initially been heading before I made my detour. If I hadn't double-checked my locks, he could have gotten inside. If I had let him approach my driver's side, he could have grabbed me. If I had turned off the engine, I might not have escaped in time. And if I hadn't checked my mirrors before getting out again, he could have caught me off guard. Everything could have ended so differently that night. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been paying attention to my surroundings. If I'd been too tired from the concert to notice the warning signs. The police later told me they'd had 3 similar reports in the past month along that stretch of highway. But no victims had been able to provide as clear a description as I had. I still drive that same route occasionally, but never at night, and I always fill up my tank in the city before heading out. This remains one of my most chilling personal stories, because even though it ended well, I can't shake the thought of how many things could have gone terribly wrong that night. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes when his friendly facade dropped. It was like watching a mask fall away to reveal what was truly underneath. My friend Ellie and I decided to take a road trip together last fall. She had been feeling suffocated by our hometown of Portland, convinced that everything was better on the other side of the country, even the people. We flew to North Carolina and rented a car that we eventually nicknamed Betty. The day before our return flight, we took Betty and drove to a small historic town to visit the childhood home of a famous novelist. Afterward, we cruised along the Outer Banks, enjoying the spectacular coastal views. We stopped at various tourist spots, and at the end of the day, we visited a famous beach to see the iconic lighthouse. Overall, it was a delightful day. As dusk began to settle in, we decided to head back to our hotel, which was about a 2-hour drive. I knew we needed gas, so I told Ellie I'd stop at the first station I spotted. The problem was that we were in a tiny tourist town, full of gift shops and seafood restaurants, but not a single gas station in sight. I was used to having gas stations on every corner back home, so at first, I wasn't too concerned. I figured one would appear soon enough, but I was completely unfamiliar with the area. So I just followed the GPS while chatting with Ellie. That's when I noticed we were no longer in town, but on a dark, winding road, surrounded by pine forests on all sides. I started to worry and pulled over to check the map for the nearest gas station. The system showed one about half a mile away. Great, I thought. Once we get there, I'll fill up and everything will be fine. I drove to that spot, and Betty informed us we had arrived. But we found ourselves at a completely dark and deserted gas station in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick woods. As far as I could tell, there wasn't anything for miles around. According to Betty's fuel gauge, we had enough gas for about 6 miles. But the next station was 18 miles away. Ellie and I remained in the car, discussing what to do next, when another vehicle pulled into the station. I continued fiddling with the GPS, not paying much attention. I assumed it was just someone else looking for gas. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone waving at me. After a brief hesitation, I rolled down the window slightly to find out what they wanted. It was a middle-aged man, with a woman in the passenger seat. He started asking a lot of questions. Are you going to get gas? Coming from the beach. Where are you headed? I responded politely, but kept my answers very brief. Then he said he was the owner of this gas station, but it didn't make sense to keep it open at night because it wasn't profitable. He mentioned knowing about another station about 2 miles from here and explained how to get there. He also gave us his phone number and said, "My name's Thomas, I'm a mechanic. If you can't make it, call me and I'll come rescue you." We thanked him sincerely and drove off. Ellie kept saying how nice he was and how something like this would never happen back in Portland. I agreed, but noted that it was a bit strange, appearing at precisely that moment in that exact place. I joked that he probably called his friend and said, "I'm sending 2 women your way." We arrived at the gas station he recommended, and a young man about 19 or 20 approached to fill our tank. He asked how we were doing and then said, "There are a bunch of weirdos out tonight." Ellie and I exchanged glances. I laughed and said, "Told you so." I asked what he meant, and then he told us that his cousin owed a lot of money to a drug dealer who was hiding somewhere nearby, and that he'd handle it himself when his shift ended. I noticed Ellie was getting nervous about all this strangeness, so I tipped the young man well, wished him luck, and we got back on the highway. At some point during our conversation, Ellie decided to call that Thomas guy, the mechanic. She left a voicemail thanking him for his help and letting him know we'd made it safely. I thought it was unnecessary, but didn't say anything. A few minutes later, we were on the road, about 10 minutes from our hotel. When Ellie's phone rang, it was Thomas again. She thanked him once more, but he started asking where we were from, when we were heading back, and all that. He introduced himself as Thomas Glossio, and mentioned he'd written a book called Wrongfully Accused, offering to let us read it on our way home. I got curious and said, "Ellie, look up what this book is about." She searched on her phone, turned pale, and looked like she was about to be sick. I asked what's wrong, and she replied he was accused of murders in Blue Ridge. In that instant, she began to panic because he now had her phone number. Back at the hotel, we decided to investigate everything. We discovered that while the real Blue Ridge killer was indeed later caught due to DNA evidence, Thomas had been identified by one of the victims during a lineup back in the 80s. He had been convicted of kidnapping and assaulting a woman in the very area we had been driving through. The book he wrote was about that very story. Due to a hurricane warning in our area, we ended up stranded there for 2 more days. It was a tense period, considering everything we had learned that night. Things could have turned out very, very badly. But in the end, I just got a story that I can now share. I remembered another story that happened to me and my best friend a few years ago, and thought it was worth sharing. We were both seniors in high school at the time. In 2018, we took a weekend trip to visit my grandmother, who lived several hours away from our town. Our town was small, but one of the largest in the region. To get to my grandmother's, we had to drive about 2 hours, passing through tiny villages surrounded by cornfields, unmarked roads without streetlights, and of course, no cell service. On our way back, we stopped at a gas station literally in the middle of nowhere. The convenience store had only a few snacks, but everything seemed abandoned. There wasn't a single car or person outside. We stopped only to refuel. I paid at the pump, mainly because I didn't want to leave my friend, small and delicate, alone in the car while I went inside. That's when another car pulled into the station and parked on the other side of the pump. I had just started filling up, and although nothing specific was happening, I was overcome by an uneasy feeling. I decided to stay outside, keeping the driver's door open, so my friend could see and hear everything that was happening. A thin man who looked to be in his early 50s got out of the car. He seemed to be paying at the pump and just waiting for his tank to fill. But after a few seconds, he walked around. "I'm only $25 short," she said. He approached my car and stopped less than 3 feet away from me. Then he asked if he could pump the gas for me. Fortunately, the nozzle was locked in place, so the gas continued to flow without my intervention. I immediately positioned myself between the door and this man, ready at any moment to jump in and close the door, or, if necessary, slam the door to protect my friend. I calmly replied, "No, thank you. I've got it under control." He looked me up and down, gave a half smile, and said something like, "Pretty girls like you shouldn't be out here alone. And they definitely shouldn't be doing this themselves. Let a man help you, princess." When he tried to reach for the nozzle, I put my hand on it and immediately yanked it firmly, then decisively closed the door. The last thing I wanted was for him to jump into the car and drive off with my friend inside. The alarm bell in my head, which until now had been amber, was now flashing bright red. I set aside all my usual politeness and remembered advice I'd read somewhere. Better to seem rude, but stay safe than to be polite and end up in a vulnerable situation. I looked him straight in the eye and seriously said, "Sir, step away from me. I know how to pump gas. I already said I don't need help. Leave us alone." He didn't move, just tilted his chin up slightly and continued to stare. I held his gaze, assessed whether I had enough gas to leave, and realized it was time to go. I yanked the nozzle from the tank and almost threw it back into the holder, then quickly got into the car and drove off. The entire time, he didn't even flinch. As I was driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed his car wasn't even connected to the pump. So it seems he had no intention of getting gas at all. He just showed up there to help a woman in distress. My friend was trembling in the passenger seat and admitted she probably would have let him pump the gas. But I was just glad I managed to stay calm and alert, and that I had the courage to act decisively, and that we were able to drive away safely. This next incident happened just yesterday evening, and honestly, I'm still a bit in shock from it all. I'll try to recount everything as it happened, although fear has somewhat blurred my memories. I work nights as an emergency dispatch operator. I was returning home around 2 in the morning and stopped at a gas station. Looking back, I realize it was an unwise decision. The place was poorly lit and completely empty, not another customer in sight. But I was familiar with the dangerous areas of Denver, and this territory wasn't usually among them. While I was filling up, I noticed a middle-aged woman sitting on the curb on the other side of the parking lot. The night was cold, and it had started to rain. She was completely soaked and dressed inappropriately for the weather. When she saw me looking at her, she shouted something to me from a distance. My second mistake that night, I responded. I felt sorry for her and walked closer to find out if she needed help. "Hey, beautiful. I'm just trying to get home, but nobody wants to help me," she said. "I'm trying to get to my sister's, but the cab ride costs $75, and I only have. I'm $40 short. Can you help me?" I don't usually give money to strangers, but she seemed genuine. The weather was terrible, and since my job is to help people, I eventually agreed. I told her I didn't have cash, but if she came with me to the store, I could withdraw some from the ATM. But the ATM wasn't working. I apologized and said I couldn't help any further. She followed me back to my car, talking while I opened the door to get in. And then she just got into my car. I was so shocked that I couldn't say anything for several seconds. I just stared at her as she settled into the passenger seat and fastened her seat belt. As soon as she got in the car, her behavior changed dramatically. She no longer seemed confused, but excited. Too excited. Too restless. "Take me to my aunt's," she said. "She can give me the money." At that moment, all my internal alarm bells went off full blast. I wanted to tell her to get out of the car, but something told me it might be dangerous. She had already shown unpredictability. She seemed to be under the influence of substances, and I didn't know if she was armed. It felt like kicking her out risked an aggressive reaction. "Where exactly do you want to go?" I asked. "Just drive straight. I'll tell you where to turn. If you want me to take you somewhere, tell me the exact address. Relax, honey. I'm not a bad person. I'm not going to rob you. Just drive. Okay, what's your aunt's address?" "It's on Blossom Street." "What house number?" As I kept asking questions, she began to get irritated. We were still in the parking lot. I thought about getting out of the car and going to the store for help, but she seemed to know the clerk. They had talked while I was trying to withdraw money. I definitely couldn't leave her alone in my car. Suddenly she yelled, "Why are you asking me so many questions? I thought we were friends. Don't you trust me? I work for the police, you know." "It's my job to ask these kinds of questions," I replied. She snapped, started screaming, calling me a snitch, saying I was trying to set her up. She was completely out of it. I was more scared than ever. I just wanted her out of my car. But I still felt that directly asking her to leave might provoke her. That's when an idea came to me. I'm not a police officer, just a dispatcher. How about we go to the supermarket and see if the ATM there is working? My plan was simple: peacefully get her out of the car and get rid of her once inside the store. She liked the idea and immediately calmed down. I knew that driving with this woman in my car was extremely risky, but it seemed like the best of bad decisions at that moment. During the ride, she didn't stop talking for a second. Her thoughts were fragmented. She jumped from topic to topic. Sometimes it seemed like she couldn't even finish a single sentence. But our conversation went something like this: "It's good that we're friends now. I have 5 or 6 more people who want to catch me. Tomorrow I'll come to your work, and we'll arrest them together, okay? We'll talk more about this tomorrow. Today, you just wanted to get home, right? Right, honey. I'm just trying to get to my sister. To your sister. I thought you wanted to go to your aunt's. Yes, yes, to my aunt's. That's right. That's why the ride costs $40. It's far, but wasn't it? $40, 75. I only have 40, but the ride costs 75. After this, there was a strange silence. Don't you want to take me to my aunt's? She lives there on Hope Street. What? You said she was on Blossom Street. I made a mistake, but what's the difference? She won't give me money anyway. Don't you want to take me to my sister's? It was becoming increasingly obvious she was making everything up. The details kept changing constantly. As soon as we stopped at the supermarket, she finally got out of the car. But only after I got out first, and she followed. She said that before going to the ATM, she needed to use the restroom. My plan was to call the police from the bathroom, but she followed me. This is where everything got even weirder. She grabbed my arm and whispered in my ear, "If you don't have money, it's okay. But tell me one thing. Do you like being caressed?" I firmly replied no. Then I instantly ran into a stall and locked the door as quickly as possible. Once I was safe, I said, "I have friends in the police who can help you better. I'm going to call them now, and we'll figure this out together." And again, as soon as she heard the word police, she started screaming. I kept repeating that the police could help her. She shouted that she was leaving and ran out of the bathroom. But it didn't end there. I waited a bit to make sure she was really gone. And as I suspected, less than a minute later, she returned and started banging on the stall door with all her might. Then she said the thing that scared me the most that night. "Hey, come back to the car with me." I forgot my beer in there. I immediately said no. I'd seen her get into my car. She was wearing only what she had on. She hadn't left anything in there. After this, she really did leave. I sat in the stall for another 5 minutes to make sure she wouldn't return, and only came out when I felt confident. I immediately went to find the store manager, who called the police. Fortunately, I was in an area served by a different precinct than where I work, because I was terribly embarrassed by my own naivety. I didn't want any of my colleagues to see me in such a situation. The officer who responded took my statement and advised me to be more careful. He said that sometimes people who ask for help can become aggressive. He mentioned they had recently received reports about a woman matching the same description who had attacked someone trying to help her. I definitely learned my lesson. It was a dangerous situation, and I was just lucky to come out of it unharmed. I'm glad my naivety didn't cost me my life. This happened to me about 5 years ago, when I was 19. My parents had gone on a week-long cruise to celebrate their anniversary, leaving me alone at our family home in Pinewood Valley. It's one of those small coastal towns in Maine where everyone knows your business before you do. Typically peaceful, especially during the off-season when tourists aren't flooding the local spots. I didn't usually mind staying alone in our old Victorian house, but something about its creaking floorboards and drafty corridors always made me uneasy, even in broad daylight. The house sits at the end of a winding road, surrounded by tall pines that cast long shadows across the property. Most nights when my parents traveled, I'd stay with friends or relatives, just to avoid the eerie silence. That Saturday in late October, I was supposed to spend the night at my friend Emma's apartment in town. We'd had a movie marathon planned for weeks, but around 9:30, her roommate came home unexpectedly with a group of friends, and it became clear there wouldn't be space for me to crash. Emma apologized profusely, but I assured her it wasn't a big deal. Her place was always chaotic on weekends anyway. I left Emma's around 9:45, maybe a bit later. A thick fog had rolled in from the ocean, shrouding the streetlights in ghostly halos. The drive home would typically take about 20 minutes, winding through the forest roads. But as I got into my car, the strangest feeling swept over me. A heavy dread that settled in my chest like a cold stone. I just couldn't bring myself to drive back to that empty house and spend the night alone. Something felt off. I can't explain it rationally. Just a gnawing intuition that I shouldn't return home by myself. I called my older brother, Ethan, who lived about 30 minutes away in the neighboring town with his girlfriend and her 7-year-old son. "Hey, any chance I could crash at your place tonight?" I asked when he picked up. "Everything okay?" His voice immediately tensed with concern. "Yeah, just don't feel like staying at Mom and Dad's alone. The place gives me the creeps." He paused for a moment. "Actually, Melissa and Tyler are visiting her parents tonight. It would make more sense if I just came over there. That way we could hang out, watch some movies." He mentioned that his Belgian Malinois, Rex, would need to come along. Rex was intensely protective and would raise absolute hell if anyone approached the property. Ethan said he'd be at our parents' house in about 30 minutes. This detail becomes important shortly. My brother isn't someone you'd want to mess with. He stands at 6'4" with broad shoulders and sleeve tattoos that run from his wrists to his collar. After 2 tours in Afghanistan, he'd returned with combat training and a hypervigilance that never quite faded. After our call, I decided to stop at the Moonlight convenience store on Route 9 to grab some snacks and kill time, hoping Ethan would arrive at the house before me. It was almost 10:30, and the parking lot was nearly deserted. Typical for our small town where most businesses close by 8. I pulled in next to the only other car there, a beat-up black SUV with tinted windows. As I stepped out, I noticed a man leaning against the brick wall beside the entrance, smoking a cigarette. There was something calculated about the way he watched me approach. He wore a dark hoodie despite the mild evening, his face partially obscured. When I reached the door, he suddenly moved to open it for me. "Appreciate it," I said with a quick smile, trying to be polite without encouraging conversation. Inside, another man stood near the magazine rack, maybe in his 30s, wearing a worn leather jacket. The moment I walked in, his eyes locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He looked me up and down with a smirk that turned my stomach. "Well, what's a pretty little thing like you doing out so late?" he drawled, his words slightly slurred. "Disgusting." I ignored him completely and walked straight to the back of the store. He called something after me, an insult I chose not to process. I figured he was drunk or high, unfortunately common in our town where opportunities were scarce, and the opioid crisis hit hard. I wasn't scared, just irritated. I grabbed some chips and soda, paid quickly, and headed for the exit. When I stepped outside, Both men were nowhere to be seen. Relief washed over me. I wasn't in the mood to deal with any more unwanted attention. I crossed the parking lot toward my car, which was about 100 feet away under a flickering light. Halfway there, I checked my phone to see if Ethan had texted me about his arrival. When I looked up, the man from inside the store was standing by the air pump, staring directly at me. I held his gaze for a moment before continuing my walk. "Hey," he called out. "When a man talks to you, you're supposed to answer." I turned just enough to respond with something sarcastic about his definition of manhood before sliding into my car. He clearly didn't appreciate my tone. I immediately locked the doors, started the engine, and just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. As I shifted into reverse, I realized the man had vanished from the air pump. I glanced around before backing out and spotted both men now sitting in the black SUV parked across from mine. They were watching me intently, talking to each other, even pointing in my direction. I stared back, more angry than afraid. During this strange standoff, the man who'd held the door made a deliberate slicing gesture across his throat, an unmistakable threat. I rolled my eyes and pulled out of the parking lot, irritated, but not yet truly frightened. To my surprise, their SUV immediately peeled out behind me, tires squealing against the wet asphalt. Still, I wasn't terrified. Just like I said, our town has plenty of people who talk big but rarely follow through. Instead of heading straight home, I turned down a couple of side streets that eventually looped back to the main road, just to see if they were actually following me. They absolutely were. When they realized I was trying to lose them, they accelerated until they were right on my bumper. High beams flashing, horn blaring continuously. They were so close, I couldn't even see their headlights in my rearview mirror anymore. My heart was racing now. This wasn't just drunk posturing. These men were deliberately hunting me. I called Ethan with trembling hands. "Ethan," my voice cracked. "There are these guys following me from the convenience store. They're right on my tail." His voice turned stone cold. "Drive straight home. Now, don't stop anywhere. I'll handle it." Despite all the detours, I was only about 5 minutes from my parents' house. I slowed slightly as I approached our long driveway, my headlights cutting through the dense fog. For the first time since leaving Emma's apartment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. There at the foot of our driveway stood Ethan, shirtless despite the autumn chill, his muscular frame tense and ready. His arms were crossed over his chest, and in one hand I could see the distinct outline of his service pistol. Rex sat alertly by his side, ears forward, a low growl rumbling from his throat. I drove past them and up the driveway toward the house. The SUV had started to follow me, but screeched to a halt when the headlights illuminated my brother and his dog. Through my rearview mirror, I watched them hesitate for just a moment before making a wild U-turn and speeding away into the fog. To this day, I don't know what might have happened if I'd stopped somewhere alone or if I hadn't called Ethan. I'll never forget that image of him standing there like some ancient guardian, and I'm endlessly grateful that he was there for me that night. What's even more chilling is what Ethan told me later. After I was safely inside, he'd found fresh tire tracks circling our property. They had apparently been there earlier, scouting our isolated home. The police later connected those men to a string of home invasions, targeting houses they knew were occupied by young women alone. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, thinking about how differently that evening could have ended. But mostly, I'm just thankful for that inexplicable feeling that warned me not to go home alone. Call it intuition, guardian angels, or just dumb luck. But something was watching out for me that night. Something happened a few hours ago, and I feel like I need to write about it to process what I experienced. I'm 21 years old and female. I work at this old roadside diner just off Highway 16, about 20 minutes from my apartment. I usually work morning shifts since I'm taking evening classes at the community college. But I've been picking up extra hours lately to save for a summer trip. Tonight was only my third time closing the place. My manager, Donna, left around 7, leaving me to handle the dinner rush alone. The diner sits on this lonely stretch of road, with nothing but dense pine forest surrounding it for miles. During winter, it gets pitch black by 5 in the afternoon, and the fog from the nearby lake often rolls in, making visibility awful. The evening was tediously normal. A few truckers stopped for coffee, an elderly couple split a slice of apple pie, and one guy who'd had a few too many at the bar down the road kept trying to get my number. I declined as politely as I could, though he wasn't happy about it. Around 10:30, when I was starting to clean up for closing at 11, I noticed a dark blue pickup truck parked at the far end of our lot. The engine was running, headlights off, but I could see the faint glow of a phone or dashboard illuminating the driver's face. They weren't coming in, just sitting there. At first, I thought maybe they were taking a break from driving or sending a text before continuing their journey. By 10:45, they still hadn't moved. I dimmed the outside lights to signal we were closing soon, hoping they'd take the hint and leave. The truck remained motionless. That's when the first real prickle of unease crept up my spine. I called my boyfriend, Marcus, not wanting to seem paranoid, but needing to voice my concern to someone. There's probably a perfectly normal explanation, I told him, trying to convince myself. Maybe they're lost and checking directions, or just some teenagers hiding from their parents while they smoke. Stay on the line with me while you close up, Marcus insisted, his voice betraying that he was more worried than he wanted to let on. I counted the register and locked the money in the safe while keeping the phone pressed to my ear. Once that was done, I went to the back office to file the day's receipts. The security camera feed showed the truck was still there, now completely dark. They had positioned it strategically, so I couldn't see the license plate, which struck me as deliberate and unsettling. Marcus, they've been sitting out there for almost 45 minutes now, I whispered, my heart beginning to race. I'm starting to freak out a little. Finish up quickly and get out of there, he said. Call me when you're in your car. Everything will be fine. To lock up the diner, I had to step outside and lock the front door from the outside, meaning my back would be to the parking lot and that mysterious truck. I knew they could see me, but I couldn't see them. The thought made my stomach twist into knots. I always carry pepper spray on my keychain, since the diner is so isolated. I made sure it was in my hand, finger on the trigger, as I stepped outside into the frigid winter air. The silence was absolute, except for the distant hooting of an owl and the soft hum of the truck's engine. As I turned to lock the door, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car door opening behind me. My heart froze mid-beat. It was like my worst nightmare materializing in real time. My hands trembled violently as I tried to turn the key in the lock, fumbling in my panic. "Just stay calm," I whispered to myself through chattering teeth. "Don't let them see you're scared." After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, I finally locked the door. I yanked the key out and walked toward my car with measured steps, fighting the urge to run. I was praying this was all just my imagination, getting the better of me. Once inside my car, doors locked, I glanced out the window. A tall figure in a dark jacket and baseball cap was moving across the parking lot, his face obscured by shadows and the thickening fog. I was still on the phone with Marcus and began to panic. "Oh my God, what do I do?" I gasped. "He's out of his truck and walking around." "Get out of there now," Marcus commanded. "Drive away and come straight to my place." I started the engine and began backing out of my spot, only to see the man hurry back to his truck. As I pulled onto the road, the truck's headlights suddenly blazed to life, and it started following me. Thinking quickly, I swerved in front of another vehicle that was passing by, probably startling them, hoping to put something between me and the truck. To my horror, the other car slowed down, and the truck accelerated to stay right behind me, its high beams now flooding my rearview mirror with blinding light. There was no denying it anymore. This person was following me, and they weren't even trying to hide it. By now my mother had joined the call, and she and Marcus were both telling me to drive to the nearest police station. I knew I couldn't go home. The last thing I wanted was for this stranger to know where I lived. "The closest police station is in Franklin," I said, my voice shaking as I took a sharp turn onto the highway. "That's 15 minutes away. Just keep driving steadily," my mom said. "Don't speed or do anything erratic. Stay on main roads where there are other cars." The truck stayed right on my tail for the entire drive, sometimes falling back a bit only to surge forward again, as if playing some sick game of cat and mouse. I've never experienced anything like the terror of those 15 minutes, constantly checking my mirrors, wondering what would happen if my car broke down, or if I had to stop at a red light. When the police station finally came into view, a flood of relief washed over me. As I approached the well-lit parking lot, the truck suddenly accelerated, roared past me, and disappeared down a side street. I pulled into the police station parking lot and sat there, shaking uncontrollably, trying to process what had just happened. After filing a report with a sympathetic officer who told me these incidents were becoming more common in the area, I drove to Marcus's place, jumping at every set of headlights I saw in my rearview mirror. When I arrived, Marcus's younger brother handed me one of his pocket knives. "Keep this with you," he said seriously, "just in case." His gesture of protection made me feel a little better, though I hoped I'd never need to use it. The following day brought another unsettling experience. I needed gas, and I made what in retrospect was a terrible decision to stop at a gas station around 11 at night on my way home from class. When I pulled in, there were several cars at the pumps, which gave me a false sense of security. I went inside to prepay with cash and returned to my car to pump the gas. By then, most cars had left, except for one pickup truck parked at the pump next to mine. I stayed in my car while the gas was pumping when suddenly I noticed a man walking in front of my vehicle, moving in an oddly deliberate way. I glanced up to see what he was doing, and our eyes met through the windshield. "Did you convert your car to propane?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly through my partially open window. I shook my head. "No, want me to pull the nozzle out for you when it's done?" He offered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "No, thank you," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. By then, the gas was nearly finished, but the man seemed reluctant to leave. He began circling my car, disappearing from view at times only to reappear at another window. I tried not to look at him directly, not wanting to engage or show fear. In my mind, I was frantically planning my escape if he was still there when I needed to get out to replace the nozzle. 5 excruciating minutes passed, with no other cars arriving at the station. The empty forecourt was illuminated only by the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, creating long shadows that seemed to stretch toward my car like grasping fingers. The temperature had dropped below freezing, but I hadn't started my car since the gas nozzle was still in the tank. I couldn't see where the man had gone until he suddenly appeared again, walking around his truck but not getting in. The moment his back was turned, I seized my chance. I quickly opened my door, removed the nozzle, and replaced it on the pump. He noticed immediately and strode toward me, calling out, "Hey." As he approached, he asked with an unsettling smile, "I don't look like a killer, do I?" His eyes had a strange gleam that seemed designed to intimidate. I thought to myself, actually, yes, you kind of do. But instead, I simply nodded vaguely, quickly closed my gas cap, and jumped into my car. I locked the doors and drove away as fast as I safely could, my heart pounding in my chest. So please, especially to women out there, avoid isolated gas stations and roadside stops at night. If you must go, bring protection and always be aware of your surroundings. I've definitely learned my lesson. While these incidents might not sound as frightening when I write them down, they could have ended very differently if I had made different choices. The world can be a dangerous place, especially when you're alone in the darkness with only strangers nearby. Trust your instincts. That feeling of unease is your body's warning system, honed by thousands of years of evolution. Don't ignore it like I almost did. And remember, no matter how routine your daily activities seem, predators are opportunists looking for vulnerability. I still don't know what those men wanted from me, and I hope I never find out. But I do know that I'll never again dismiss that cold feeling of dread that washes over you when something isn't right. That feeling might just save your life someday. I spent a week visiting some college friends in Vermont. I live in Arizona now, so the journey was particularly long. A cross-country flight followed by a rental car drive through winding mountain roads. On my last day there, as I was scrolling through social media at my friend's cabin, my old buddy Marcus commented on my Instagram story asking when I was heading back home. I replied that I was actually leaving that very afternoon. "No way," he messaged back. "I'm living about 45 minutes from there now, and it's right on your way to Burlington Airport. You absolutely have to stop by." I hadn't seen Marcus in nearly 7 years, not since our graduation. While we still followed each other online, we hadn't actually spoken in person for what felt like a lifetime. The thought of catching up, even briefly, was tempting. "I've got a late flight," I typed back. "I could swing by for an hour or two." "Perfect," he replied, sending his address. When I plugged it into my GPS, it showed a drive of almost exactly 1 hour deeper into the rural countryside than I'd expected. But I figured it was worth the detour. Marcus and I had been inseparable during our undergrad years, pulling all-nighters for finals and spending countless weekends hiking through these very mountains. It seemed fitting to reconnect here, where we'd formed so many of our memories. When I finally turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to his place, I was surprised by what I found. The house was an old Victorian farmhouse, probably built sometime in the late 1800s. It wasn't exactly dilapidated, but time had clearly taken its toll, the white paint peeling in places, the wraparound porch sagging slightly on one corner. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I approached the heavy front door. Before I could knock, it swung open, and there stood Marcus beaming. "Look what the wind blew in," he exclaimed, pulling me into a bear hug that nearly crushed my ribs. Some friendships remain untouched by time, and ours was apparently one of them. He ushered me inside, and I was immediately struck by the interior. It matched the exterior perfectly charming, but undeniably old. Vintage wallpaper, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum, and hardwood floors that announced every footstep with a distinctive groan. "When did you become an antique collector?" I joked, running my hand along a weathered bookshelf. "Came with the place," he explained. "I'm renting it from an elderly couple who moved to Florida. Most of this stuff has been here since the 20s, from what they told me." There was something captivating about the space, slightly eerie, but also magical, like stepping into another era entirely. We settled in the living room, where a fire was crackling in an old stone fireplace. Marcus opened a bottle of local whiskey, and we started catching up, reminiscing about our college days and filling in the gaps of our current lives. One glass turned into two into three, and before I knew it, the sunlight outside had faded completely. My head was pleasantly fuzzy, the warmth from the fireplace and alcohol creating a comfortable cocoon around us. "What time's your flight again?" Marcus asked, his words slightly slurred. I checked my phone and cursed. It was at 9. "It's 8:15 now." "There's no way you'll make it," he said, shaking his head. "The airport's at least 2 hours from here, with the construction on Route 7. My shoulders slumped as I realized he was right. Between the alcohol in my system and the unfamiliar dark mountain roads, driving wasn't a smart option anyway. "You can stay here tonight," Marcus offered. "I'll make us some food, and you can catch the first flight out tomorrow morning." I hesitated briefly, but the decision was already made for me. I called the airline, paid the change fee, and rebooked for the following day. "You got a couch I can crash on?" I asked. "Better than that," Marcus replied. "I've got a guest room upstairs. It's nothing fancy, but it's more comfortable than my lumpy couch." We ordered pizza from the only place that delivered this far out, finished the bottle of whiskey, and continued talking until well past midnight. By the time Marcus showed me to the guest room, I was thoroughly exhausted and more than a little drunk. I barely registered the details of the room, just that it was cold, with stale air that suggested it hadn't been used in quite some time. There was an old four-poster bed with a quilt that looked handmade, a dresser with a cloudy mirror, and heavy curtains covering what I assumed was a window. "Bathrooms down the hall if you need it," Marcus said, flicking on a lamp beside the bed. "Sleep well." I mumbled my thanks, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed without even bothering to change. The last thing I remember was the oddly comforting sound of the wind whistling through the eaves of the old house. I woke sometime in the middle of the night, my mouth desert dry and my head already beginning to throb. The room was pitch black, except for a sliver of moonlight cutting through a gap in the curtains. I lay there for a moment, disoriented, trying to remember where I was. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, near what appeared to be a closet door, was a figure. At first, my alcohol-addled brain assumed it was a coat hanging on a hook, a dark silhouette against the slightly lighter wall. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the shape was wrong. The top was broad, like shoulders, and the way it hung suggested a human form more than any article of clothing. My heart began to pound against my rib cage. I didn't remember seeing anything hanging there when I'd entered the room. But then again, I'd been so tired and drunk, I might not have noticed a marching band in the corner. I rolled onto my side, facing away from the corner, trying to convince myself it was nothing. "It's just a coat," I whispered to myself, "or a bathrobe, or a shadow." But curiosity and fear overcame me, and I rolled back to look again. It was still there, and now, in the dim moonlight, I could swear I saw the subtle expansion and contraction of breathing. I squeezed my eyes shut tight, pulled the quilt over my head like a child, and forced myself to slow my breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won out over terror, and I drifted back to sleep. I'm not sure how much time passed before I woke again. This time, it wasn't just the discomfort of dehydration that roused me. It was a sound. A soft creaking, like someone carefully treading across the old wooden floorboards, trying not to make noise. My eyes snapped open. The room was now bathed in the gray light of early dawn, the first rays of sunlight beginning to penetrate the heavy curtains. I turned my head toward the corner, and my stomach dropped. The figure was gone. I sat up so quickly that my vision swam, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin despite the chill in the room. My mouth went even drier than before, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure it could be heard throughout the house. The corner was empty. The closet door was slightly ajar, but nothing hung there. I threw off the covers and bolted from the room, nearly tripping over my own feet in my haste to reach Marcus's bedroom down the hall. He was sound asleep, snoring softly, completely unaware of my panicked state. It took several attempts to shake him awake, his eyes finally opening with groggy confusion. "The coat," I gasped, "or whatever it was." It was hanging in the corner of the room, by the closet, watching me. Marcus rubbed his eyes, clearly struggling to process my words. "What coat?" he asked. "The black figure," I insisted, standing in the corner. It looked like a person. He sat up now, more alert, his brow furrowed with concern. "There's no coat in that room," he said slowly. "And there's no hook by the closet either." I stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile, to reveal this was all some elaborate prank. But his expression remained serious, even worried. "Show me," he said. He followed me back to the guest room. where I pointed to the exact spot where I'd seen the figure. "Right there," I said, my finger trembling slightly. It was right there, watching me. Marcus scratched his head and asked if I was sure it wasn't just a nightmare. "I know what I saw," I insisted, my voice breaking slightly. "I woke up and it was there. Then I woke up again and it was gone." We stood in silence for a moment, the strange atmosphere of the old house pressing down on us like a physical weight. Finally, Marcus sighed and agreed we should check the house, just to be safe. We searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. No signs of a break-in. No strange coat hanging anywhere. Nothing that could explain what I'd seen. Over coffee, Marcus tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was sleep paralysis, or the whiskey playing tricks on my mind, or the strange shadows in an unfamiliar room. I wanted to believe him. I really didn't want to consider the alternative. But there was something else I hadn't told him, something I couldn't quite bring myself to say out loud. Just before I'd fallen asleep the first time, in that brief moment between consciousness and dreaming, I could have sworn I heard someone whisper my name, so softly it might have been the wind. And when I'd woken the second time, when the figure was gone, the air in the room had been different, not just colder, but somehow charged, like the lingering electricity after a thunderstorm. As soon as it was fully light outside, I made my excuses, thanked Marcus for his hospitality, and left. I felt a strange sense of guilt leaving him alone in that house, but I couldn't stay another minute. The entire drive to the airport, my mind kept returning to that moment, to waking and seeing the dark figure standing in the corner, watching me as I slept, and how it had simply vanished by morning. Perhaps Marcus really did play a cruel joke on me, though he's never admitted to it to this day. Or perhaps, just perhaps, someone or something really was in that house, watching me while I slept, and then disappeared with the night. What troubles me most, even now, is the voicemail I received from Marcus 3 weeks later. "Hey," his voice sounded strained, uncertain. "This is going to sound crazy, but I was wondering if you left something in the guest room when you stayed over. A dark coat, maybe, because I keep finding it hanging by the closet at night, but it's gone in the morning. Call me back when you get this." I never did call him back. Some questions are better left unanswered. This happened to me during the summer after I graduated high school. I was 20 years old. My parents had planned this road trip along the Oregon coast, and they let me bring my best friend Cassie along. We'd been looking forward to this trip for months. A week of driving up the scenic coastal highway, hiking through ancient forests, and ending at the famous Sundown Festival that happens every August in Astoria. For the first 3 days, everything was perfect. We stayed at pre-booked campsites, cooked meals over open fires, and spent our days taking photos of breathtaking ocean views. It wasn't until the 4th day that things took an unexpected turn. We were supposed to reach Miller's Bay by nightfall, where we had reservations at a well-reviewed campground. But our car broke down halfway there, something with the radiator. And by the time we got it fixed at a small-town mechanic, we'd lost 5 hours and knew we wouldn't make it to Miller's Bay before they closed their gates at 10. My dad spent an hour making calls, searching for any available campsite within a reasonable distance. Nothing, he announced, tossing his phone onto the dashboard. There's some kind of vintage car show happening in every town nearby. Everything's booked solid. So what do we do? I asked. My mom pulled up a map on her tablet. There's a place called Ravens Point, about 30 minutes from here. It's a state park with a small parking area near some hiking trails. We could park there and set up camp just for tonight. Is that even legal? Cassie asked. Dad shrugged. Probably not officially, but people do it all the time. We'll be gone by sunrise. We arrived at Ravens Point just after 11 at night. The small gravel parking lot was empty, except for one beat-up pickup truck parked at the far end. There was something about it that made me uneasy. It was covered in mud, with what looked like deep scratches along the passenger door. Looks like someone's out night fishing, Dad said, pointing toward a narrow trail that apparently led to a small lake. I remember distinctly thinking we should find somewhere else, but I didn't say anything. We were all exhausted, and the thought of driving around in the dark looking for another spot seemed worse than staying here. Dad backed our SUV toward the tree line, giving us a bit of privacy in case any rangers came by. We quickly set up our tents, one for my parents and one for Cassie and me. By 1 a.m, we were finally settled. Cassie and I were lying in our sleeping bags, scrolling through social media on our phones, and sharing a bag of chips when we heard it. A metallic scraping sound from somewhere near the pickup truck. We both froze. The sound came again, like metal striking against rock, followed by what sounded distinctly like digging. "What is that?" Cassie whispered, her face illuminated by the blue glow of her phone. "Probably just the person who owns the truck," I said, trying to sound calm. Then we heard a heavy thud, like something substantial being dropped into the bed of the pickup. The sound echoed across the parking lot, followed immediately by the slam of a tailgate. Cassie grabbed my arm. "Taylor, that doesn't sound right." I pulled out my phone and texted my cousin who lived in Portland. I described where we were and asked if he knew anything about Ravens Point. His response came quickly, "Get out of there now. That place is bad news. Last month, the police found a meth lab in those woods. There have been reports of people going missing around there." Before I could even process this information, we heard the pickup's engine roar to life. The headlights swept across our tent as it pulled out of the parking lot, tires spitting gravel as it accelerated away. "They're gone," I whispered to Cassie. "It's okay." We sat in silence for about 15 minutes, our heartbeats finally starting to slow. I was just about to suggest we try to get some sleep when it happened. A scream, primal and terrifying, echoed from somewhere deep in the forest. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human, but distorted with pain or terror. Cassie's hand clamped over her mouth. I fumbled for my phone and texted my mom, telling her what we'd heard. No response. I called her. When she finally answered, her voice was groggy with sleep. "Mom, did you hear that scream?" "What?" "No, honey, we didn't hear anything. You're probably just hearing coyotes or something." "That was not a coyote," I insisted. "Try to get some sleep," she said. "We'll be out of here in a few hours." I hung up, feeling abandoned and terrified. Cassie and I huddled together under our sleeping bags, straining to hear any other sounds from the forest. That's when the silence became even more unnerving. It was too quiet. No insects, no wind, nothing. Just absolute stillness. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the gravel, circling our campsite. I turned off my phone immediately, plunging our tent into darkness. The footsteps moved around our tent, then toward my parents' tent, then around our car. They were unhurried, methodical, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. I could hear Cassie's breathing beside me, shallow and quick. My own heart was pounding so hard, I was sure it was audible outside the tent. The footsteps stopped directly in front of our tent. I could sense someone standing there, staring at the thin fabric that separated us. In that moment, I realized how vulnerable we were. Then came the sound of tires on gravel. The pickup was back. Its headlights swept across our tent again, making the red fabric glow like blood. I risked a peek through the small mesh window and saw a figure, just a silhouette standing by the pickup truck. The truck door opened and the figure climbed in. Then the vehicle sped away again, even faster than before. We sat frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then I saw headlights again, but this time they were followed by flashing red and blue lights. A police cruiser raced past our camping spot, in the same direction the pickup had gone. Neither of us slept that night. Around 4 a.m, we couldn't take being in the tent anymore and moved to the locked car, where I kept watch while Cassie finally dozed off. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we crept back to our tent just to save face with my parents. When we all woke up, we told my parents everything that had happened. I heard those footsteps too, my mom admitted, and someone breathing outside our tent. Heavy breathing. I was too scared to say anything when you called. My dad, who had apparently slept through the entire ordeal, looked concerned as we recounted the events of the night. "Let's pack up and get out of here," he said. We broke camp in record time and were back on the road before 8. Despite the terrifying night, we tried to enjoy the sundown festival when we reached Astoria the next day. But I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. That evening in our hotel room, I searched for news about Ravens Point. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 weeks earlier, police had discovered a body buried in a shallow grave near the hiking trails. The victim had been a witness in a major drug trafficking case. And just 1 week before our stay, another person had gone missing from the same area. Their car found abandoned in that very same parking lot. I've replayed that night in my mind hundreds of times since then. Who was screaming in those woods? What was being dug up or buried with that shovel? And was the police car chasing the pickup, or were they working together? I'll never know what really happened at Ravens Point that night. But one thing's for sure. I check campground reviews a lot more carefully these days, and we always make reservations in advance. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear those slow, deliberate footsteps circling my house. I used to be a supervisor doing trauma scene cleanup work about 20 years ago. We handled everything from homicides, unattended deaths, explosions, fires, and accidents. I have a few stories, but I won't make this a super long post. Being on 24-hour call, we get emergency calls at all hours. One night past midnight, we received a call about a house fire. The fire was already put out, but we were called to remove debris from public view, board up the property, and make sure everything was as safe as possible. It was reported that the family suffered multiple deaths in the fire, so we had to secure the scene for investigators. Once we arrived, we saw the house at the end of a cul-de-sac, a large 2-story house in a nice neighborhood. My partner and I got to work immediately. Our first task was to board up the openings cut by the firefighters. The interior was very dark since, as with every fire, the electricity had been cut off. We normally carried old 6-volt lanterns and hammers hatchets on our work belts. Inside, it was still very hot, and debris was everywhere. My partner, Jake, was a big football player type, so I always knew that if we ran into trouble, we'd have each other's backs. We started boarding up a large sliding door in the back of the house, just off the kitchen. We both kept stopping and looking around, doing so without mentioning it to each other, until we finally exchanged glances and said, "Did you see that?" We'd been seeing shadows moving behind us, but whenever we turned around or shined our flashlights, nothing was there. We began working faster, frequently glancing over our shoulders, until we heard a noise from upstairs. Now, you have to understand, it's not uncommon for kids or people to enter unattended burned-out structures. Sometimes it's out of curiosity, other times to see what they can steal. Assuming we'd either confront kids or someone trying to take from the family, we grabbed our lights and hammers and went upstairs. We cleared each room, starting with the one closest to the top of the stairs. Jake would enter a room while I stayed in the hallway, and we'd switch off until we came to a bathroom at the end of the hall. At that point, we figured we just heard settling noises from the fire. After all, most of the roof and ceiling were gone, leaving only rafters above, and the fire had been so intense that much of the upstairs was almost burned off from midway up the walls to the roof. We made our way back downstairs and started working on another window when once again we heard another noise from upstairs. This time it didn't sound like settling. It sounded like something dragging, accompanied by footsteps. We continued working until we heard noises again from upstairs, this time sounding like a door closing. Jake and I exchanged looks and said, "Okay, let's go." We headed back upstairs, searching room to room, checking closets under beds. Every inch of space a person could be, nothing. We went back downstairs to continue working, but we kept hearing noises from upstairs and still saw shadows moving around us. Our final task was to secure the front door. With all the other downstairs openings secured, we shut the front door and began securing it when all of a sudden, someone started banging on the door from inside. I turned to Jake, but he was already running toward the truck. I grabbed our stuff and ran after him. By the time I reached the truck, he was already backing out of the driveway. I jumped in, and we drove about a mile down the road, while I yelled over to him that the back roll-up door was still open. He replied, "Forget that. I'm not stopping." I was working in Kuwait on an old military base, about 20 miles outside of Iraq. The base had been overrun by Iraq during the first Gulf War. I'm not sure how many died at the base, but the Kuwaiti generals were hanged by the Iraqi military on the base flagpoles, while the remaining staff were lined up outside the old building of the Kuwaiti Officer Club and shot to death by the Iraqis. Eventually, the base was taken back with the help of the U.S. military. All around the base, there were these small buildings we worked out of from time to time. I was an aviation mechanic. Apparently, back in the day, they served as bomb-proof hangars for fighter jets and storage. When the U.S. and its allies reclaimed it, they bombed the base with bunker busters, and it turned out the hangars weren't as bomb-proof as they had thought. What's left now are hangars with gigantic holes on top of them, about 12 feet of concrete and rebar torn apart. The insides of the hangars were a mess, just what you expect from something that had been blown up. Our location was particularly secluded and quiet, and at times I would be the only one there. One night my crew loaded up to go get food, and I had to stay behind as I was in the middle of a job. While working, I heard something that sounded like footsteps in the sand behind me. Imagine the Kuwait desert as a beach with no water. I turned around thinking one of my crew had come back, so I asked, "Forget something." But when I looked, there was nothing there. I shook it off and continued working. A few minutes later, I heard movement in the sand again, but this time it sounded like running. I instantly thought my crew was messing with me, so I turned around, expecting to be tackled or put in a headlock, as we often joked around that way. But again, I turned around to nothing. There wasn't much else I could do, so I just ran into the hangar. When the crew returned with food, I told them what had happened. They called me crazy, and we all laughed it off. A few nights later, a similar situation occurred, but this time I wasn't alone. My supervisor was with me. We both heard running footsteps, and then we heard screams coming from the direction of the hangar. We knew for a fact that we were the only ones there. Over time, we all began experiencing similar situations. The most common things were the footsteps running in the sand, our names being called by no one, and the screams. Once my supervisor was listening on the radio, waiting for a plane to land, when he suddenly heard a woman crying. He threw the headset down and ran over to me, saying, "Dude, I think I'm losing my mind." I remember his face was pale, and he looked genuinely scared. Mind you, he was not the type to admit being frightened. We didn't tell anyone else about it. About a week later, our logistics clerk was in the office ordering parts over the phone. Suddenly she screamed, throwing the phone, shouting, "What in the world? There's a lady crying on the phone." My supervisor looked at me and then told her about what he'd heard on the radio. We didn't really know how to react, to be honest. I think we were relieved that we weren't going crazy and that it was happening to everyone. I grew up in a large city in eastern Canada. The whole of my life at that point had been spent around noise and light, traffic and tides of people. It made the concept of quiet solitude very appealing, and I'd learned to seek these things out and appreciate them whenever I could. So when the opportunity arose to visit my parents' home, I took it. They grew up in the far eastern part of Canada, on the island of Nova Scotia. Not from the big city there, but from a small town. One of those towns you can see by standing on the biggest street within it. A remote part of a remote island in a remote country seemed like gold to me, especially at that time in my life. I was in my early 20s. I'd shotgunned straight out of college, aimed at a career, intent on making my mark. But the city I was in wasn't particularly accepting of my skills or the language I spoke, so finding work was difficult and depressing. I gained a lot more than I should have. I ate more. I drank more. Everyone thought it was a good idea for a change of pace. Healthy even. Of the trip, I will only describe our descent, for it is the most opportune use of the word. If you've never been in a small plane at night, flying above a sea of clouds during a full moon, then you were missing one of the few plane-based pleasures available to people in the era of human flight. It's magical. The sky looked like wet black tarmac and headlights. So many stars, there seemed to be more than the sky could hold. Hovering in the middle of them was this spotlight of a moon, almost too bright to look at. These things together lit the rolling clouds beneath the plane. It looked like pillow stuffing spread out horizon to horizon, all cast in a silver blue light. It felt like I could walk on it, like it was only a few feet below the fuselage. It moved and breathed and changed as we flew over it. It really is a perfect memory. Then we dove down through that perfection into darkness. We arrived at a small airport outside their hometown. We could have driven from Halifax, but elected not to. Overnight driving in Nova Scotia is perilous for people not accustomed to small roads and wildlife that still remains mostly wild. If your car hits a moose at 60 km/h, the moose won't be what gets scraped off the road. We still had some driving to do, though. Their hometown was not where we would be staying, but a cabin that had been in the family for years, about 30 minutes away in the woods. My lifestyle back on the mainland, fueled by disappointment and depression, had given me two things I couldn't shake while I landed: a desire to be outside and a completely messed up internal clock. I was so used to playing Ultima Online until 4:00 a.m. every night that 2:00 a.m. felt pretty early. So when my parents went to bed, I let them know I was going for a walk. They understood, and Nova Scotia is not known for violent crimes in the woods, so there was no real concern. I took a flashlight and a walking stick, mostly to avoid turning an ankle and for swatting away any unwanted attention from local fauna. Not that a broomstick would do much against an aggressive animal, but if you've ever gone walking anywhere not fully tamed, it just feels good to have something solid in your hands. So off I went. Now, ever since our descent, I've been experiencing this general sense of tension. I attributed it to a new place, no real creature comforts except some books and a lack of computer. Maybe it was just the absence of that amazing scene above the clouds. Whatever it was, that feeling ratcheted up several levels just a few minutes from the house. I shelved it. I figured I'd acclimate shortly, and this was a clearly defined walking path that I knew circled around the small lake next to the cabin and would bring me right back there in a couple of kilometers. Probably a 45-minute walk if I kept a good pace, an hour if I was a bit more casual. The whole way around, I would be able to see the cabin, so I wouldn't lose my orientation. All in all, I'm trying to say I had my bases covered. I even had light, as the moon I'd seen earlier was still overhead, poking out from the overcast sky regularly enough to see. The clouds were fast, as they can be so close to the sea. So I'm walking down the path, woods to my right, thick, impenetrable pine, and to my left, the small lake, like glossy black frosted glass by the wind and the moon. Solo walks are great for thinking, so I let my mind wander. The path was well kept, and the stick and flashlight were utterly unnecessary. At some indeterminate point in the walk, I felt someone walk over my grave. You know those slow chills when you can feel the wave of goosebumps appear, fingering up your back, neck, forearms, and everything goes tight. I realized I was staring at the lake, at the white noise of the reflective light, and not paying attention to the woods. I became irrationally certain that something terrible was in the woods. I flicked on my flashlight as I turned to look, and it was like sinking in a hot tub. The goosebumps vanished, and the woods seemed utterly unremarkable. Mollified, I continued walking. Then it happened again, the exact same feeling. Once more, I realized I was absent-mindedly staring at the lake, wondering if my house was going to go IDOC in UO. I remember that specifically. At this point, I noticed the cabin almost directly across from me, beyond the lake. I am as far as I'm going to get from the house during my walk, and all I want is to be back there with one of my books. As this thought crosses my mind, I noticed that a small part of the reflection on the lake is missing. It's just gone, like someone went over it with a Sharpie. So I look at that spot, focus on it. Of all the bad decisions in my life, that's the one I would wish to take back the most. Even while my Homo sapien brain is trying to assign some reason for this absence of reflection. Half-sunk boat, bed of reeds, weird stone outcropping. My lizard brain is telling me to get away as fast as I can. The spot is getting bigger. It is something man-shaped walking out of the water toward me, very clearly walking, backlit by the moon. I'm frozen. I can't move. It's getting close to shore when I realize I still have a flashlight. One of the big ones people in cabins like to keep around. I dropped my stick and fumbled with the flashlight, not breaking eye contact with this thing. I find the switch, which was right where it should be, under my thumb, but hey, panic, and shine it at this man shape. Of course, there's nothing there at all, just water and moonlight, reflections all the way back to the cabin. I swear I stood there for 5 minutes, motionless except for my eyes, which recrossed, searching the entire lake. Finally, I decide I'm imagining things, despite every inch of me still screaming to run. I resolve to head back the way I came, at double speed. I flip the light switch off to get my night vision back. The thing is exactly where it would be if it hadn't stopped approaching, right where I had been pointing my light. Close enough now to start obscuring part of the cabin. Literally visible in the dark, but not in the light. I froze for some amount of time, probably only a few seconds, but it felt like a lot longer. It got closer, like water moves noisily, but regularly. You watch reflections on it, and it's just noise. There are no regular waves or anything. It's just a constant shimmer. The edges of this thing were like that. It was hard to notice at first, because just the lake was behind my view of it. But as it eclipsed the cabin and some of the ground, I very clearly saw its edges move just like the lake. Some people have described it as scribbles. Some have called it static. I feel like these are synonymous descriptions of what I saw. At about 10 feet, I realized there wasn't going to be any kind of stopping. It wasn't going to stop and say something or resolve itself into some drunk person or anything I wanted to deal with. So instead of panicking, I dropped the flashlight I heard it break and sprinted back to the cabin. I fell once, skinning my shin pretty roughly, but made it back to the cabin in about 10 minutes. I wasn't in great shape. I returned to the house. My head was pounding, ears roaring, and I felt nauseous. I stumbled in and collapsed into the downstairs bedroom. 2-floor cabin, parents upstairs. They were undisturbed by my noisiness, and I collapsed into bed. Then I noticed my one window was framing the lake like a painting. Everything just outside the window was pitch black moon on the other side of the house. I decided I couldn't deal with that, so I went back out to the main room and closed all the doors and windows I could see and slept on the sofa. At some point, hours later, crashing from the adrenaline and the run, I fell asleep. The next morning, my parents woke me up coming downstairs. They asked me why I was sleeping on the couch, fully clothed, and why my jeans were ripped. I was too self-conscious at this point to say anything close to the truth, so I just said I fell, lost a flashlight, and had to come back and just fell asleep on the couch by accident. They bought it. I didn't sleep well or much at all. So I decided to go to actual bed and get some actual sleep. I walked over, opened the door to my room, and lying perfectly aligned on the bed was a broken flashlight covered in dirt and the brimstone, side by side like matchsticks. The window was locked. I'm a nurse. Story number 1. I had just graduated from nursing school and started my role as the charge nurse on the medical surgical unit when this incident occurred. On our med-surg unit, the night shift charge nurse takes the same patient load as all the other nurses. On the first night of my weekend trio of shifts, I assigned myself a patient called Mrs. F. Mrs. F was a morbidly obese lady with a small bowel obstruction who had refused to have an NG tube placed to help drain her stomach. No big deal really, since she was ordered to have nothing by mouth, no food or drink, and wasn't experiencing any nausea or vomiting at the time. She seemed as sane as you and me. Anyway, I got the creepiest feeling from her that Friday night for some reason. She mentioned how she usually talks to her dead mother, which I don't think is strange at all. Still, she gave me an uneasy feeling. Fast forward to the next night. For some reason, she had changed rooms, so I didn't mind assigning her to another nurse. At one point during the night, she pressed the call button. I couldn't understand what she said over the intercom, so I walked down to her room to see what she needed. She wanted some water, so I went and got her some. When I returned to the room, she told me something that I found awfully peculiar. I can remember exactly what she said. They had a party for me today. I asked, "Who did?" She replied with a huge smile on her face, "My friends and family. Some I haven't seen in 20 years. I said, "Wow, they must have come from far away." I know my eyes widened when she clarified, "No, they have been dead for that long." It was the most beautiful party. It really made me wonder why a 40-something-year-old, seemingly sane woman would say something like this. I got my answer about 2 hours later, when a white-faced coworker walked out of Mrs. F's room and yelled that we needed to call a code. It was too late for Mrs. F. It looked like she had died at least 30 minutes before we found her. I immediately understood what she meant by her party. It must have been a going-away party. Story number 2. It was a pretty slow night on the med-surg floor. There were only 2 of us working on the 3rd floor, another nurse and myself. The 3rd floor ends with a window to the outside on one side, and locked double doors to the labor and delivery ward on the other. I was in the room closest to the L and D ward, in the B side of the room. The bed was empty. I was fiddling with my patient IV pump. The curtain dividing the room was pulled. I didn't think much about it. I heard rustling and footsteps around B, as I thought it was the other nurse getting the bed ready for an admission that they must have called about while I was busy. I said, "Are we getting one?" No answer. I yanked the curtain back, and nobody was there. The bed was empty, and I looked at it confused. I stepped out of the room and saw the other nurse way down at the nurse's station, doing her charting just like I had left her. I called out, "Were you just in here?" She said no. I asked if anyone else was on the floor except for us. Another no answer. I never figured out who or what was right beside me on the other side of the curtain. Story number 3. This story takes place on the same floor as the 2 stories above. I had a patient admitted to our unit to die. It always made me sad for patients to die alone with no family. So I put an oxygen saturation monitor on him to alarm once his saturation dropped below 50 or 60%. I can't remember which specifically. Anyway, I was doing rounds and opened his door to peek in on him. The room was dark and the hall light was on, so naturally, my shadow was cast on the wall opposite me. That particular night, I was working with a very tall, very stout coworker. While I was peeking in, a very large, tall shadow in the shape of a person covered mine on the wall. I spun around, thinking that my fellow nurse was behind me, but there was nobody. Story number 4. I happened to be working in the psych unit one night with 2 nursing assistants. We were all sitting at the front end of the hall charting, talking, etc. We all heard what could be described as something being dropped. One of the assistants got up and made her way down the hall to try to find the source of the noise. She found everyone in the 12-bed unit fast asleep. We heard the noise again, this time louder. I took off this time, determined to figure out what was going on. I briefly noted a pair of sneakers on the floor in a room to my left. I walked on, peeking into rooms, when I heard the noise again, louder and behind me. I turned around quickly and walked back toward the room with the sneakers on the floor. This time, they were both in different positions. The patient in that bed was still fast asleep. It couldn't have been him throwing the shoes around, because he required maximum assistance to transfer to bed. I ran as fast as I could down the hall back to the nursing assistants, and wouldn't go anywhere by myself for the rest of the night. Story number 5. Once again, I was on the med-surg floor, sitting at the desk with my coworker, not long after shift change. The floor was very light that night, with only about 5 patients. There were 2 men in a room together to the left of the nurse's station, and 3 ladies in separate rooms to the right. All of a sudden, a loud and angry male voice was heard by my coworker and me. "Kristen," he growled. We looked at each other, terrified with white eyes, and practically ran into the room with the 2 male patients. We startled them coming in so fast. One was texting away on his cell phone, while the other was flipping channels. We asked which one of them yelled. Neither had. We checked all the other patients. All ladies, mind you, and they said they hadn't called out. We went through all the empty rooms and found nothing. Another night, not long after that, another nurse and I heard loud sobbing. We checked all the rooms and found nobody crying. Story number 6. I'm a home health nurse now, and this happened a few years ago. I was going to a patient's house that I had never visited before. I pulled up to what looked like the main entrance, a screen and window to the side of the house. There were tall shelves against the windows in that room. I noticed the figure of a cat walking across the tops of the shelves pretty quickly, toward the screen door that I was about to open. So, not wanting to let the cat out, I decided to go to the front door instead. I walked around the house to the front door, and the man who answered, the patient, looked a bit confused that I used that door instead of the one I pulled up to. I explained that I didn't want to let the cat out. He said something like, "Honey, there hasn't been a cat that lived here in 3 years." I told him I was certain I'd just seen a cat walking across the tops of the shelves. We sat in that room for his visit, just so he could prove to me that there was no living cat there. Last story. Once again on the med-surg floor, there was a call light in a hallway that was no longer used, which would ring from time to time. We would always just cancel it out at the nurse's station and blame it on the ghost. Well, one night it rang, and I guess I was feeling brave, so I marched down there, determined to catch a glimpse of the ghost in the room. I swung the door open. A figure sat up slowly from the bed. It turned out that it was an out-of-town lady from the transplant team, waiting for someone who was on life support to be taken off because he was a donor. I seriously thought I was going to faint while I saw the ghost sit up in the bed. This is an account of something weird that happened to my mom when she was a kid. The first thing you should know before reading the story is that my mom is Korean. Back in her generation, many houses were still made of brick and cheap materials. My mom's childhood home was a typical one for that time, spacious, with 2 rooms, one for the living room and kitchen, and one for the bedroom where all the family members slept on the floor. One toilet outside the house, and the entire place surrounded by a wall made of stones stacked high onto each other. My mom's family was relatively poor back then, as nearly everyone else was at that time. So nearly everything that my mom, her 2 younger sisters, and younger brother owned was second-hand or made out of scraps by my grandmother. One day, their mother, my grandma, made a doll out of an old national flag that they owned. A little rag doll with a smile stitched into its face. My mom hated it at first sight. It was ugly, and the buttons for eyes and the white grin on its face were creepy in her opinion. A few days passed without anything happening, but my mother always felt like she was being watched during those days. She shrugged it off, thinking she was being silly, but she never stayed in the same room as the doll without someone else present. Then she started having nightmares. In her dreams, she would see the doll moving by itself. She would hide from it as it wandered around. It would leave the living room where it had been left and open the door to their sleeping space, staring at the sleeping bodies of her family and herself. Every morning, my mom would wake up with chills down her spine. But again, she ignored the ominous feeling that crept in each night, always seeing the same dream of the doll moving and giggling. After all, her parents were the no-nonsense sort, and she thought they would have little patience for the seemingly overactive imagination of a little girl. But then one night, the dream changed. The doll was no longer wandering around inside the house. Instead, it went outside, dragging a hammer with it. As it clumsily stepped toward the wall surrounding the house, it then started hitting the stone wall. Crack after crack, the grinning doll continued to hit the wall until my mom woke up. The dream scared her. The previous dreams had been creepy but bearable. But now the doll was actually breaking something. She had a sinking feeling that the doll was not as harmless and innocent as it looked. She couldn't stand it anymore, so she told her siblings and their mother about her dreams. Luckily, my grandmother was surprisingly superstitious for someone who seemed to take things very seriously. In Korea, dreams, as well as other spiritual aspects of our lives, were taken quite seriously. Even today, many Korean shamans are somewhat feared and respected. Later that night, the family left the doll locked in the bedroom so that it couldn't get to the wall while they camped out in the living room with candles lit. They fell asleep. Then they woke up to a loud crash from the room next to them. It was early in the morning when it was still dark outside. My grandmother quickly unlocked the bedroom door, only to see the room in shambles. The bedroom wall had caved in. Chillingly, it was the wall that had faced a part of the stone wall that the doll had been smashing in her dream. The section of the outside wall closest to their bedroom had somehow broken off, with the heavy stones crashing into the wooden wall of the bedroom. The stones had fallen to where, if the family had not relocated, they would have crushed her and her family to death. More creepily, although everything in the room had been crushed, broken, and covered in dust, the doll remained as pristine and smiling as it always had, in the corner of the room facing the wall next to the living room. It could have been a coincidence. The wall could have been worn down from the weather, and a strong burst of wind could have knocked it over. But that didn't explain why she had been plagued by the doll in her dreams, why the wall would suddenly fall the night after she dreamed of the doll hitting it, nor how the doll managed to get to the corner opposite to where they had stationed it before locking the room. That day, my grandmother tossed the doll into a fire. When I moved in, I knew immediately something was up. They acted way too nice. I have read that renting from couples can be strange because they have a very specific way of living, and any disruption to that balance might lead to unpredictable reactions. After 4 weeks of living there, I noticed that they still hadn't fully moved in. We had arrived around the same time, and though they were 2 people, and I was only 1, it was hard not to notice the myriad of boxes and belongings flying around. Eventually, I started looking up the telltale signs of hoarders. They definitely fit the bill, and the stuff began to pile up. They have piles of random items all over the house now, and food everywhere. I have never seen so much food in a house. Their cupboards are always filled to bursting with junk food. They have more than a few 24 packs of soda and energy drinks scattered in the garage, on the deck, in the basement, on the dining room floor, in the kitchen, in the living room, everywhere. Their fridge and freezer are always completely filled, sometimes overflowing, with the most random foods, not typical items like frozen pizzas, sandwich ingredients, or leftovers, either. I'm talking elk sausages, 15 different types of cheese, more almond milk than one could imagine, and loads of garlic, stuff like that. Besides an overstocked fridge and freezer, they have a box freezer in the garage that's filled to the brim and takes up most of the space that's supposed to be mine. They also have tons of beer in my fridge, usually about 9 or so six-packs. They have garbage lying in the living room all the time, too. Sometimes 3 or 4 copies of every movie they own. And they constantly have a lot of dishes in the sink. They had to order secondary garbage and recycling bins for the street because they have so much to throw out. All of this, and they can't hold a conversation. Whenever I talk to them, the conversation always devolves into teasing and insults directed at me. I have to make up an excuse to leave the room, or else they'll just keep going for an hour or more. They'll tease the way I talk, which is pretty normal, the way I walk through the house, the clothes I wear, t-shirts and jeans or sweatpants. They twist every conversation we have into a way to make fun of me, or whoever they're talking to. It's creepy, to say the least. I started researching their behaviors, hoping to get some insight into why they might act the way they do. I found an article on narcissism that perfectly defines my landlady, and more than a few posts about PTSD that make my landlord look like a cookie-cutter person, fitting perfectly into that category. I still haven't figured out why they hoard so much stuff, but I'm working on it. But hey, maybe you're not convinced. Well, here's the kicker. After a couple of months, I started hearing the stairs leading down to my part of the house creak a lot. You have to walk down the stairs and turn a sharp corner to get to where I live, so you can't see the stairs until you're right in front of them. Then I started to overhear them gossip about me when they would eat in the living room. I also noticed that certain things were moved in my bathroom or bedroom. I keep an air circulation fan on pretty much all the time because I live underground, and the place gets musty if I don't leave the fan on. But I would find it turned off after getting back from work or something. Or I would find that a light had been left on that I was sure I had turned off. So I got a couple of tiny cameras, planted one across from the stairs and one in my room. Turns out my landlady had been eavesdropping on my phone calls by going halfway down the stairs and just listening and rummaging around my room. She wouldn't take anything, just rearranging my books and movies, flipping through my personal documents, trying to access my computer, looking through my trash, checking the pockets of my coats, testing my power outlets. Once she even played a video game. She would also use my bathroom. I thought about it for a week and decided to do nothing. Just keep the footage on a flash drive and wait until I move somewhere safe to do something with it. Maybe show them or show the police, or both. Probably both. We share a stove, and whenever I cook, I can see them peeking at me around the corner. My landlady has very loud phone conversations with her mother, where she yells and screams, calling her a derogatory name. My landlord sleepwalks. They leave leftover food on the counters overnight, sometimes for days at a time, before cleaning it up. They installed very high-tech keypad locks on every door in the house. I'm talking really expensive, high-quality stuff. Despite living in a neighborhood with the lowest crime rates in the whole city, they lie about me constantly to each other, talking openly in areas of the house where they know I can hear them. They blame every household accident on me, even ones that happen in their private areas of the house. This is random, but I noticed that they have no wall art or decorations at all. They own exactly 26 rolls of duct tape, as I found out after trying to find a hammer in the garage. And of course, no strange couple would be complete without a secret room that only the landlord has a key to. They told me never, ever to go back there, even though I can't possibly get the door open without an axe. They never told me anything about themselves. They asked me tons of personal questions while I moved in, but they wouldn't answer any of mine back. I found out from my landlady's mother that my landlady is adopted and used to be a teacher, but is now a nurse. And my landlord is an ex-US Marine who works on the computer from home. Not even she knows what his actual job is. Why do I still live here, you ask? The rent is cheap, and I'm very poor. Also, the neighborhood is right next to a bunch of shopping centers and restaurants, which is great for someone like me who has no car. Why am I sharing all this? I have to get it off my chest, and I'm too scared to tell anyone I know. One last thing, whenever I would do something like forget to lock the door, leave crumbs on the counter, even though they leave crazy messes in the kitchen every day, or accidentally put a pizza box in the recycling bin, they would both say the exact same thing. We legitimately hurt you. Stop doing that. Those words exactly, every time from both of them. It didn't matter which one told me. They would both say the same thing in the same way. It creeped me out. Now they have a baby who is usually at its grandparents' house, and my landlady told me that if I ever wake up the baby, she'll have to kill me. Am I scared of them and the way they live? Yes. Am I looking for somewhere else to live? Yes, always. I just walked in on a psycho breaking into my mother's house. I'm a 14-year-old male. My mom's house is across the street from my dad's house. I live at my dad's house. About a week or so ago, I bought myself a PlayStation 5. It seemed like a great idea at the time, but after I realized that I needed Wi-Fi for the majority of its functions, I was pretty disappointed in myself. My dad doesn't have internet, but my mom does. With that out of the way, I'll tell the bulk of my story. My friend recently bought Far Cry 6. I don't have the money for that, so he said we could game share. Basically, I get the game off of him without buying it, and I could get it for free. It was around 10:30 at night when I unplugged my PS5 to take it over to my mom's house to begin downloading the game. I brought one of my pocket knives with me because it was dark outside, and I'm an avid listener of scary stories, always preparing for the worst. Thank God I did today. It was a short walk to my mom's house, less than 2 minutes. I opened the door. Inside, my mom was downtown celebrating her friend's birthday, and she had a bad habit of keeping the door unlocked. I made a mental note to scold her about it later. Before I walked in, I turned to look over at the living room where I saw him. Some old man was sitting in my mom's recliner, just reading a book. He looked strange. He didn't look like a drifter, but his eyes had this crazy look that I'll never forget, like they were detached from reality. And he stank like a body covered in spoiled milk. I could smell it from across the room. He turned to look at me, and I felt my blood run cold. He just smiled at me and closed the book. He stared at me like that for a few minutes, before standing up and opening his arms as if he wanted a hug. "I'm a visitor," he spoke. His voice sounded as crazy as his eyes looked. That's when I snapped out of my state and ran out of my mom's house, running as fast as I could to my dad's house, thanking God for lacrosse conditioning. I made it there in less than a minute, remember. My dad's house is right across the street from my mom's, literally. I quickly entered my dad's house and shut the door, locking both locks before running around the house, locking every window and covering them with the blinds. I placed my PS5, which I had held onto when I ran stupid, down on the couch before dialing the police and telling them the details of what happened. I was told to stay on the line with the dispatcher, and I did. She told me to go into my room and lock the door. I took my dogs inside the room with me and locked the door. Now my bed is in the middle of my room, and the head of my bed is right underneath the window. I stupidly sat up against the window, wanting to see my whole room. I removed my knife from my pocket and opened it up, holding it tightly in my hands as I sat in panicked silence. Suddenly, my older dog, Max, looked at me and started to growl. I was confused before I realized that he wasn't growling at me. He was growling at my window. Suddenly, I heard a loud crashing noise as the crazy man broke my window open, probably with a bat or stick from my backyard. I felt his arm wrap around my neck as he started dragging me through my broken window, the shards of glass cutting into my skin. I slashed and stabbed my knife behind me blindly. I heard the man curse in pain as his grip loosened. I stabbed his arm a couple of times before wriggling myself from his grasp. My dogs jumped out of my window and began to attack the man. The police ran into my backyard. I grabbed my dogs by their collars and pulled them back. I wanted to let them attack the man. I wanted to let them kill him, but I didn't want them to get in the way of the officers. The man was cuffed and placed into the patrol car. They asked me a few questions before they sent me to call my dad, as he was also out at dinner. They took me to the hospital, and I got the more severe cuts stitched up. They sent me back to my house maybe an hour ago. I started typing this almost right after I got home, around 12:30 a.m. Some closing thoughts. I want to tell everyone reading to lock their doors. These things can happen to anyone. The world is full of horrible people, and you may just be their next victim if your door is unlocked when you're not home or asleep. I also want to thank the officers and the dispatcher that I talked to. The dispatcher helped keep me calm, and the officers got the man cuffed and in the car quickly, and were very kind to me when asking me questions. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.